Nobody ever expects to become a believer in something they've always dismissed as folklore and superstition. Growing up in the sprawling, predictable landscape of suburban Massachusetts, a world defined by strip malls and cookie-cutter subdivisions, I heard plenty of stories about mysterious creatures lurking in the dense, ancient forests of New England. These were tales whispered around summer camp bonfires, stories about enormous bipedal beasts that moved silently through the pine woods, leaving behind nothing but massive, unidentifiable footprints and branches snapped impossibly high off the ground. My friends and I would laugh about these stories, making jokes about the blurry, out-of-focus photographs taken by people with shaking hands, about individuals who claimed to have seen impossible things in the woods, but somehow never managed to capture a single shred of clear, verifiable evidence. I was always the skeptic in any group, the one who'd patiently explain away every strange sound in the woods with rational explanations rooted in biology and physics. That owl call that sounded almost human, almost like someone crying out in distress, just a barred owl with an unusual vocal pattern, a common variation, nothing supernatural about it. Those massive tracks in the mud that seemed too large to belong to any known animal? Obviously, a black bear, the prints distorted and enlarged by rain and erosion, a simple trick of light and shadow. The broken branches 8 feet off the ground that local folklore attributed to territorial markers left by forest giants. Wind damage? Nothing more? Or maybe a particularly large bear reaching up to get at a beehive or mark its territory, perfectly explainable within the known parameters of the natural world. I chalked it all up to overactive imagination and too much time in the wilderness making people see things that weren't there, a classic case of pattern recognition running wild in an environment our brains weren't evolved to fully understand. Our minds are wired to see faces in clouds, to find meaning in randomness, to create narratives that explain the unexplainable. That's all these sightings were, I was convinced, just our pattern-seeking brains working overtime in an environment full of shadows, ambiguity, and the profound, sometimes unsettling silence of the deep woods. That skepticism, that absolute certainty in the impossibility of these legends, that unshakable confidence in my rational scientific worldview, lasted until last spring. Something happened in the deep woods of northern Maine that fundamentally altered my understanding of what's possible in this world, that shattered my comfortable certainty and replaced it with a bewildering mixture of wonder and confusion. What I'm about to share with you isn't embellished for dramatic effect or fictional entertainment. I'm not trying to sell you a book or convince you of some fringe agenda. Every detail is exactly as it occurred, with no exaggeration, no artistic license. And even though nearly 10 months have passed since that initial encounter, I still find myself sometimes lying awake at night, staring at the rough-hewn beams of my ceiling, questioning whether it was all real, whether I actually experienced what I remember experiencing. But the evidence is there, undeniable and constant, reminding me daily that the world is stranger and more mysterious than I ever imagined, that there are things walking this earth that science hasn't catalogued, creatures that exist in the vast, unexplored blind spots of human knowledge. After my marriage fell apart 3 years ago, a dissolution that was both inevitable and utterly devastating, I needed to escape the suffocating familiarity of city life. I needed to get away from the apartment where every corner held a ghost, every object a memory of better times. I had to get away from the well-meaning friends who didn't know whether to offer sympathy or avoid the subject entirely, their awkwardness a constant reminder of my failure. I had to break free from the routine that had once provided comfort, but now felt like a prison, each day a perfect replica of the one before. My grandmother had owned a small, rustic hunting lodge in the backwoods of Maine, a property she'd inherited from her father, who'd built it in the 1940s as a place to escape civilization and chase white-tailed deer through the vibrant autumn woods. The lodge sits about 55 miles from the nearest actual town, if you can call a collection of 300 people, one general store, and a post office a town. When my grandmother died, she left the property to me, probably figuring I was the only one in the family crazy enough or desperate enough to actually use the place, to appreciate what she'd always called the blessing of true solitude. My siblings wanted no part of it, saw it as a money pit in the middle of nowhere, and suggested we sell it to some developer who'd turn it into a luxury hunting resort for wealthy tourists. But I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't let the place my grandmother loved, the place that represented a simpler, more authentic way of life, become something commercial and artificial. The lodge sits in a valley surrounded by thick stands of white pine and hemlock, completely isolated from civilization in a way that's hard to find anymore in this hyper-connected world. There are no power lines running out this far, no telephone poles, no evidence of human infrastructure beyond the lodge itself, and the barely maintained logging road that provides the only access. My closest neighbor, if you can call him that, lives roughly 10 miles away down that logging road, a road that's barely passable for half the year when mud season turns it into a quagmire or winter snow drifts close it entirely. He's an older gentleman named Frank who keeps to himself and respects others doing the same, which makes him a perfect neighbor as far as I'm concerned. We wave when we pass each other in town every few weeks, exchange a few words about the weather and the wildlife, and that's the extent of our interaction. The isolation was exactly what I needed when I moved out here permanently. I craved silence, I craved space, I craved the absence of human complication and drama. In the city, I'd been surrounded by millions of people but felt utterly alone. Out here, actually alone, I paradoxically felt more connected to something, though I couldn't have articulated what that something was at the time. The lodge itself is modest in every way, essentially a single large room with a sleeping loft accessed by a steep, creaking ladder. The kitchen area is barely more than a propane-powered camp stove, and a sink with a manual pump that draws frigid, iron-rich water from a deep well. A massive stone fireplace, built from river rocks hauled from the nearby stream, provides the only heat during the brutal Maine winters when temperatures regularly drop below zero and snow accumulates in drifts taller than a man. The previous owners, my great-grandfather and then my grandmother, had built small additions and modifications over the decades, but the core structure remained simple and functional. There's no cell service out here, no internet connection except for a satellite system I could have installed but chose not to. There is only the constant whisper of wind through the trees and the occasional haunting cry of a loon from the lake 3 miles north. At night, the silence is so profound it's almost oppressive if you're not used to it. A physical weight on your eardrums, broken only by the sounds of nocturnal animals going about their business, the hoot of owls, the yipping of distant coyotes, the rustling of smaller creatures in the underbrush. I make my living through a combination of odd jobs in town when I need cash for supplies I can't produce myself. Things like flour, coffee, and fuel for the generator I run for a few hours each day, and wild crafting. Wild crafting is a fancy term for harvesting plants, mushrooms, and other materials from the forest to sell to herbal suppliers and specialty food distributors who've discovered there's a lucrative market for authentic, wild harvested products. My grandmother taught me the skill when I was young, taking me on long walks through the woods during summer vacations. She showed me which plants had value either as food or medicine, which mushrooms were safe to eat and which would kill you or make you wish you were dead. She taught me how to read the subtle signs that indicated where rare herbs might grow, the specific combination of soil type, sun exposure, and moisture level that created ideal conditions for various species. She'd quiz me constantly pointing at a plant and asking me to identify it, to describe its properties, to explain when and how to harvest it sustainably. At the time, I thought it was just a grandmother sharing her hobbies with her favorite grandchild, a way to pass the time during long, slow summer days. I never imagined it would become the primary source of my income decades later. After I moved to the lodge permanently, that childhood education became my economic foundation. Some weeks I'd spend 5 or 6 days out in the forest, hiking miles with my collection bags and field guides, gathering whatever the season offered. The forest operates on its own calendar, and each week brings new opportunities. Wild leeks or ramps in early spring, their pungent, garlicky aroma filling the air when you find a good patch. Selling for premium prices to high-end restaurants in Portland and Boston. Fiddlehead ferns in late April, each one carefully harvested before it unfurls into a full fern, delicate and delicious when prepared correctly. Numerous mushroom varieties throughout the summer and fall, from common chanterelles to the rare and prized hen of the woods, each requiring specific knowledge about identification and sustainable harvesting practices. Medicinal roots and barks year-round, things like ginseng root and slippery elm bark that commanded high prices from herbalists and natural medicine suppliers. The work kept me fed and gave me a sense of purpose, a reason to be out in the forest every day, paying attention to the subtle changes in the ecosystem, the way certain plants responded to rainfall or temperature shifts, the intricate web of relationships between all living things. The day everything changed was in late April. It was that perfect, fleeting moment when winter finally releases its iron grip. But before the black flies emerge to make the woods unbearable for humans, those few precious weeks when the forest is most accessible and beautiful. The birch trees were just beginning to leaf out, their bare branches now sporting that particular shade of vibrant, almost electric, yellow-green that signals new growth. The forest floor was carpeted with spring wildflowers, trilliums, jack-in-the-pulpits, and spring beauties, creating a delicate mosaic of white and purple against the dark, damp earth. I'd packed my usual supplies that morning, several canvas bags that I'd sewn myself from heavy material, my harvesting knife that my grandmother had given me decades ago with its worn wooden handle, and a blade I kept razor sharp, a canteen filled with filtered water from the well, some dried venison I'd made the previous fall from a deer I'd harvested, a detailed topographical map of the region marked with locations where I'd found valuable plants in previous years. I headed out around 8 in the morning to check a location about 4 miles west of the lodge where I knew a good population of ramps grew. Ramps were one of the first valuable crops of spring, their assertive, garlicky flavor prized by chefs, and their appearance signaling the true beginning of the foraging season. The hike was gorgeous in that way, unique to spring mornings in the northern forest. Everything smelled fresh and alive after months of frozen dormancy, the earth exhaling with relief as temperatures climbed above freezing for the first time in months. I could hear spring peepers calling from every vernal pool, those tiny frogs producing an almost deafening chorus despite their small size, a sound that always made me happy because it meant winter was truly over. The morning sun created those perfect diagonal beams through the canopy that photographers chase and never quite capture. Light streaming down in visible shafts through the morning mist that still clung to the ground, illuminating particles of pollen and dust floating in the still air. I walked at my usual pace, not hurrying, taking time to observe everything around me, noting which plants were emerging, where deer had browsed recently, whether any predators had passed through based on tracks and scat. You can read a forest like a book if you know the language, each sign telling part of a larger story. I reached the ramp patch around 10 and spent a solid 90 minutes carefully harvesting, making sure to take only the larger plants and leave plenty behind to reseed, ensuring this patch would be productive for years to come. Sustainable harvesting is critical if you want to keep returning to the same spots year after year. Take too much and you kill the resource, leave the right amount, and it actually encourages more vigorous growth. My bags were getting pleasantly heavy, that satisfying weight that meant a successful morning and money in my pocket once I got these to market, when I decided to explore a bit further west, into a section of forest I'd never thoroughly investigated. My grandmother had always said there was more wild ginseng in the western sections of the property, but she'd never shown me exactly where. And I figured this was a good opportunity to scout new territory while the undergrowth was still manageable. That's when I heard something that immediately triggered every primitive alarm in my brain, activating instincts that trace back thousands of generations. It wasn't a sound that belonged in these woods, nothing like the calls of birds or the rustling of small mammals or even the occasional grunt of a bear, which I'd heard often enough to recognize. At first, I thought maybe it was wind moving through a hollow tree, creating that eerie moaning sound that can mimic a voice. But when I stopped walking and really listened, I realized the air was completely still, not even a breeze to move the newly emerged leaves. Then I considered that maybe I was hearing a wounded deer, which would explain the distressed quality of the sound. But this was different, deeper, more labored. It was breathing, I realized, with a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was heavy, rattling, and desperate, the kind of gasping that indicates severe distress or injury. When every single breath is a monumental struggle, the sound had a rhythmic quality to it, in and out, each exhalation seeming to cost an enormous, painful effort. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to turn around and head back to the lodge, to not investigate this sound, to get away from whatever was making it. In the wilderness, strange sounds usually mean danger, something you want to avoid rather than approach. But I've always had this compulsive need to investigate, to understand, especially when it involves suffering. I've pulled dozens of animals out of old traps and snares over the years, spent hours carefully extracting porcupine quills from lost hunting dogs, nursed injured raccoons and foxes back to health before releasing them back into the wild. My ex-wife used to say it was my defining characteristic, this inability to ignore suffering even when helping created inconvenience or risk. She meant it as a compliment early in our marriage, but as a criticism toward the end. I set my bags down carefully, hiding them under a fallen log so I could find them again, and moved toward the sound, trying to step quietly on the soft, damp forest floor, placing each boot carefully to avoid snapping twigs that might alert whatever was ahead to my approach. The breathing grew louder as I approached a small depression in the terrain. A natural bowl, maybe 40 feet across, surrounded by thick stands of young hemlock whose branches hung so low they created walls of impenetrable greenery. These depressions are common in this kind of terrain, formed by glacial activity thousands of years ago, often holding water in spring but dry by summer. When I pushed through the last screen of branches and saw what was making that sound, my entire body locked up, every muscle tensing simultaneously. For several seconds, maybe longer, time seemed to stop completely as I literally couldn't process the information my eyes were sending to my brain. My mind kept rejecting what I was seeing, trying to reinterpret it as something that made sense, something that fit into my understanding of what was possible. The creature was enormous, easily 9 feet tall, even lying down as it was, propped against a massive boulder at the edge of the depression. It was covered entirely in thick fur that looked almost reddish-brown in the dappled sunlight filtering through the hemlocks, long and somewhat matted, especially around the torso and limbs, where it seemed to have collected dirt and forest debris. But what struck me most forcefully What made my brain finally accept that I was seeing something real and not hallucinating was how utterly human the proportions were. The torso was broad and muscular, but recognizably human in structure, with clearly defined shoulders and a chest that rose and fell with that labored breathing. The arms were long, but not grotesquely so, proportioned like a human's but scaled up, ending in hands that were clearly hands, not paws. With distinct fingers and opposable thumbs, the legs were similarly human-like in their basic structure, though massively muscled. The face was something between human and ape, with a prominent brow ridge that cast deep shadows over the eyes, a flat nose with flared nostrils, and a mouth that seemed capable of much more expression than any normal animal, lips that could purse or pull back, capable of nuanced movement. The creature's eyes were what really got me, what made the initial shock give way to something else, something more complex than simple fear. They were large and dark, almost black, but with an unmistakable, piercing intelligence behind them. These weren't the eyes of an animal operating on pure instinct. These were eyes that thought, that evaluated, that understood. And more than intelligence, I saw emotion in those eyes, pain that was physical and immediate, exhaustion that went bone deep, and the raw fear of death that was approaching inexorably. The creature was watching me with those eyes, and I could see the calculation happening in real time, the assessment of whether I represented a threat that needed to be fled from, or possibly, desperately, something else, some kind of help. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 20 or 30 seconds. During that frozen moment, I noticed more details that my brain catalogued automatically, even as the rest of me remained paralyzed. The creature's right leg was extended at an unnatural angle, bent in a way that legs shouldn't bend, clearly badly broken. The fur around the lower part of the leg was darker than the rest, matted with what had to be dried blood, crusty and brown. There was visible swelling even through the thick fur, a significant bulge where the bone had broken and displaced. The creature's breathing was labored, its chest rising and falling with obvious effort, and I could see the outline of its ribcage showing through the fur, individual ribs visible in a way that indicated serious malnourishment, likely weeks of insufficient food. This creature, whatever it was in the process of dying, wasting away in this hidden depression where no one would ever find it. The creature made a sound then, and it's that sound that I hear sometimes in my dreams that haunts my quietest moments. It wasn't aggressive or threatening, nothing like the roar you'd expect from a large predator. It was something closer to a whimper, a vocalization of pain and desperation that communicated suffering in a way that transcended species. The sound had layers to it, a complexity that indicated emotional depth, not just physical distress, but psychological anguish, an awareness of its own mortality. It tried to shift its position, probably to ease pressure on the injured leg, or maybe just to get more comfortable, and I saw the visible wince, the shudder that ran through its entire massive frame, muscles spasming in response to the searing pain. In that instant, all my fear evaporated completely, replaced by something more powerful, an empathy that overrode every survival instinct. This wasn't a monster or a threat. This was a living being in agony, unable to care for itself, slowly starving to death in this remote depression where no one would ever find it, dying alone in fear and pain. I thought about the dried venison in my pack, probably 6 or 7 strips that I'd planned to eat throughout the day, enough to keep my energy up during a long day of hiking and foraging. Moving very slowly and deliberately, keeping my eyes on the creature the whole time, telegraphing every movement so as not to startle it, I reached into my pack and pulled out a strip of venison. The creature's reaction was immediate and powerful. Its nostrils flared dramatically, its head lifting slightly from where it had been resting against the boulder, and I saw the muscles in its neck tense with the effort of holding that position. It could smell the food, and the intensity of its response told me everything I needed to know about how hungry this creature was. How long it had been since it last ate anything substantial. I took one piece of venison and tossed it gently, not directly toward the creature, but about halfway between us, wanting to offer the food without seeming threatening or aggressive. The strip landed on a patch of moss about 12 feet from where the creature lay. Those dark eyes tracked the food, locked onto it with an intensity that was almost painful to witness, the kind of laser focus that comes from true desperation. Then it reached out with one of those massive hands, fingers stretching toward the venison. And I got my first clear look at the appendage up close. The hand was huge, probably 3 times the size of my own, with thick, leathery pads on the palm and fingertips that looked like they'd been worn smooth by decades of contact with rough surfaces. The fingers were longer than human fingers, more like a primate's, with joints that seemed to allow for exceptional flexibility. The nails looked more like hardened bone than keratin, thick and yellowish, with dirt caked under each one. The creature grabbed the venison with those enormous fingers and brought it to its mouth, practically inhaling the strip, barely chewing before swallowing, its throat working as the food went down. I saw something in its eyes then that might have been satisfaction or relief. A brief moment when the physical pain seemed to recede slightly in the face of finally having food. I threw another piece, this one landing a bit closer to where the creature lay. It snatched this one up just as quickly, stuffing it into its mouth with that same desperate hunger that spoke of weeks or possibly months of insufficient nutrition. The breathing was still labored, still sounded painful and difficult, but there was a subtle shift in the quality, as though the promise of food, the hope of survival, was providing some small comfort or relief from despair. I threw a third piece, then a fourth, watching as the creature devoured each strip. With every piece, I took a small step forward, gradually closing the distance between us, testing whether it would tolerate my approach or whether proximity would trigger defensive behavior. The creature watched my movements carefully, but didn't react aggressively, didn't try to flee despite its obvious fear, didn't make any threatening displays. It just ate, those intelligent eyes moving between the food and my face, trying to understand what was happening, whether this was real or some kind of hallucination born of starvation. I had 2 strips of venison left. Instead of throwing the next one, I held it out, my arm fully extended, and took 2 more steps forward. Now I was maybe 8 feet away from this creature, close enough to see the individual hairs in its fur, close enough to smell it, which was a combination of wet earth, dried blood, and something musky but not entirely unpleasant, like an animal smell, but with notes that were almost human. The creature stared at the venison in my hand, then at my face, and I could see the internal conflict playing out in those expressive eyes, visible as clearly as if it were speaking. Hunger versus self-preservation, need versus caution, desperation versus the lifetime of instinct that surely told it humans were dangerous and to be avoided. Hunger won, as I suspected it would. The creature extended one of those enormous hands, reaching toward me, and I held perfectly still, barely breathing, aware that I was taking an enormous risk, but unable to stop myself. Its fingers closed around the venison with surprising gentleness, plucking the strip from my palm without touching my skin. And I saw that gentleness was deliberate, controlled, indicating fine motor skills and an awareness of its own immense strength. It ate this piece more slowly, chewing deliberately, and I wondered if some part of it understood that eating too quickly after prolonged starvation could cause problems, or if it was simply savoring the taste after so long without food. Through the entire process, it never took its eyes off my face, studying me with an intensity that felt almost uncomfortable, as though it was trying to understand not just what I was, but who I was. We stayed frozen like that for a long moment, me standing there with my empty hand still extended, the creature chewing slowly, both of us trying to figure out what happened next. both of us suspended in this impossible situation that neither of us could have anticipated. The creature made another vocalization, softer than before, almost like a sigh or a grunt that might have been gratitude or acknowledgement or simply relief at not being alone anymore in its suffering. Then it glanced down at its injured leg, back up at me, and in that moment I saw clear communication in those eyes, an intention and a request as obvious as if it had spoken words. It understood that it needed help, that its injury was beyond its ability to self-treat, and it was asking if I could provide that help, whether I had the knowledge or compassion or willingness to do something that might save its life. I looked at the leg more carefully now that I was closer, really examining the injury for the first time. The break was obvious even through the thick fur, about halfway down the shin, with the bone clearly displaced, creating an unnatural angle that made my own leg ache in sympathy. The fur around the injury was crusted with old blood, brown and stiff, indicating the injury had happened days or possibly weeks ago. I could see the swelling even through the thick coat, the limb noticeably larger around the breakpoint, an inflammation that suggested possible infection or at minimum significant trauma. A broken leg in the wilderness is essentially a death sentence for any creature, human or otherwise. You can't hunt effectively, can't forage with the mobility required to find food, can't move quickly enough to avoid predators or other threats. This creature had probably been lying here for days, maybe a week or more, unable to find food, slowly weakening as dehydration and starvation took their inevitable toll. I've set bones before. I helped my grandmother splint a neighbor's dog's leg once when I was 16, and I assisted a veterinarian friend with a deer that got hit by a car on the highway near my grandmother's property. The basic principle is always the same, regardless of the size of the animal. Immobilize the break, keep it stable and straight, and give the bone time to knit back together naturally. But this was fundamentally different from any medical intervention I'd ever attempted. This was a creature that shouldn't exist according to everything I'd been taught, according to all of human scientific knowledge. This was something out of folklore and legend, something that serious people didn't believe in, and I was contemplating whether I could actually help it, whether my limited medical knowledge would be sufficient, whether it would even allow me to try. I looked around the depression, assessing what materials were available, and spotted two relatively straight branches, each about 3 feet long and roughly as thick as a broomstick, dense hardwood that looked strong enough to serve as splints. I picked them up and showed them to the creature, holding them up alongside its injured leg without touching it, communicating my intention through gesture. The creature watched intently, and I saw understanding dawn in those dark eyes, a recognition of what I was planning to do. That recognition was shocking in its implications. This creature understood cause and effect, understood that immobilizing the leg might help it heal, understood medical principles that should have been beyond an animal's comprehension. The level of intelligence suggested by that understanding was staggering. The creature shifted its position slightly, extending the injured leg toward me as much as it could, which must have been agonizing given the severity of the break, but it did it anyway, voluntarily cooperating with what it understood would be a painful process. That gesture, that deliberate cooperation, cemented my decision completely. This wasn't just an animal operating on instinct. This was an intelligent being capable of understanding complex situations and making rational choices, choosing to endure immediate pain in exchange for the possibility of healing. I needed materials to bind the splint, and I used my knife to cut long strips from the bottom of my shirt, creating several pieces of fabric, sacrificing my clothing without a second thought, because in this moment, nothing else mattered except helping this creature survive. I knelt down next to that massive leg, my hands actually shaking, partly from adrenaline and partly from the sheer enormity of what I was attempting, and began the process of setting the bone. The creature made sounds during this, low groans and whimpers that absolutely tore at my heart, vocalizations of pain that were disturbingly similar to human sounds of suffering. But it didn't pull away or try to stop me, didn't lash out despite the obvious agony, maintaining that cooperation even as I manipulated the injured limb, even as tears formed in those dark eyes from the pain. I positioned the two branches on either side of the break, aligning them as carefully as I could, then began wrapping the fabric strips around them, binding the splint as tightly as I dared without cutting off circulation, making sure the bone was straight and immobilized. The whole process took maybe 15 minutes, though it felt much longer, and by the end, sweat was pouring down my face despite the cool spring air, soaking through my remaining shirt and dripping into my eyes. When I finished, I sat back on my heels and examined my work, trying to assess whether it would hold, whether I'd done enough. It wasn't perfect by any means, not the kind of professional medical intervention this injury deserved, but it was solid. The splint held the leg stable, would prevent further damage to the break, and would give the bone a chance to heal naturally if the creature could get enough nutrition to support the healing process. The creature looked at its leg for a long moment, moving it slightly to test the splint, then looked at me and made a sound that was unmistakably grateful, a complex vocalization that seemed to convey multiple emotions simultaneously: relief, gratitude, and something else I couldn't quite identify. Then it surprised me completely by reaching out with one of those huge hands and gently, very gently, touching my shoulder. The contact lasted only a second, barely long enough to register the warmth of its palm through my shirt. But the meaning was absolutely clear despite the absence of a shared language. "Thank you. You saved me. I owe you." I stood up, my knees cracking after kneeling for so long on the hard ground, and realized I'd just used all my food to feed this creature. I had a 4-mile hike back to the lodge with nothing to eat, but somehow that didn't bother me at all. What bothered me, what I couldn't stop thinking about, was leaving this creature here, still vulnerable, still unable to hunt or forage effectively, even with the splinted leg. Recovery would take weeks at minimum, possibly months depending on the severity of the break and whether any complications developed. During that entire time, it would need regular food, water, and possibly help with other basic needs. I couldn't just walk away and hope for the best. I'd started this intervention, and now I had a responsibility to see it through. I made a decision that probably would have seemed insane to anyone else, that would have been impossible to explain to my ex-wife or my friends or anyone from my previous life. I held up one finger in a universal gesture of wait, then pointed at myself and then in the direction of my lodge, trying to communicate through gesture what I couldn't say with words. "Wait here. I'm going to come back with more supplies. Don't give up." The creature watched me, its head tilted slightly in what might have been curiosity or confusion, and I saw comprehension in its expression, an understanding that transcended the absence of a shared language. It knew I was leaving temporarily, but would return. That understanding, that ability to grasp complex temporal concepts like future intention, was yet more evidence of its sophisticated cognition. I gathered up my bags of ramps, the mundane harvest that had been my entire focus just an hour ago but now seemed trivial and unimportant, and began the hike back to the lodge, my mind racing the entire time, thoughts cascading over each other in no particular order. What had I just done? What was that creature? Bigfoot was supposed to be a myth, a legend, something that didn't actually exist outside of blurry photographs, questionable eyewitness accounts, and late-night television programs about unexplained phenomena. The scientific consensus was clear. There was no compelling evidence for the existence of large, undiscovered hominids in North America, no bones or clear photographs or DNA evidence that would satisfy rigorous scientific scrutiny. Every alleged sighting could be explained as misidentification of known animals or deliberate hoaxes, or the wishful thinking of people who wanted to believe in something mysterious. But I'd just touched one, fed one, splinted its broken leg. It was real, undeniably real, as solid and physical as anything I'd ever encountered. And I'd just formed some kind of bond with it, an understanding that felt significant, that felt like the beginning of something I couldn't possibly predict or control. Back at the lodge, I immediately started preparing supplies, working with a frantic energy born of urgency and purpose. I cooked up a huge pot of rice and beans, using up most of my remaining rice and all of my dried beans, not caring about my own food situation because this was more important. I made a dozen peanut butter sandwiches thick with protein and wrapped them individually in wax paper. I gathered some apples and carrots from my root cellar, vegetables I'd stored from the previous fall, adding variety to the provisions. I filled a large canteen with clean well water, knowing hydration would be critical for healing. I packed everything into a large backpack along with a heavy wool blanket, some basic first aid supplies, including antiseptic and bandages in case the splint caused any skin damage, and a flashlight in case I ended up staying longer than planned. I headed back out less than 2 hours after returning, adrenaline pushing me faster than I normally hike, practically jogging on the flatter sections of trail, desperate to get back before dark, before the creature might think I'd abandoned it. I made good time despite the heavy pack, arriving back at the depression while there was still good light. When I pushed through the hemlock screen into the clearing, the creature was still there, still propped against that boulder in the same position. Its head lifted immediately when I appeared, and I saw recognition in its eyes, followed by what might have been relief or happiness or gratitude, emotions playing across its face in ways that seemed distinctly primate-like, distinctly human. I unpacked all the food I'd brought and spread it out in front of the creature, a feast by any standard, certainly by the standard of someone who hadn't eaten in weeks. It ate with slightly less desperation this time, actually taking the time to chew properly, to taste what it was eating, and I saw enjoyment in its expression, a pleasure at flavors after so long subsisting on nothing. I sat down about 6 feet away and watched. In that golden late afternoon light that filtered through the hemlocks, I had a chance to really observe this creature in detail without the adrenaline and shock that had clouded my initial encounter. It was definitely female. I could see that now in the body structure. The slightly narrower shoulders compared to hip width, the different proportions of limb length to torso, subtle markers that indicated female gender in a way that transcended species. She was magnificent, really, powerful and wild, and completely outside of human categorization, belonging to no taxonomy I'd ever studied, fitting no neat scientific category. Her movements were graceful, despite the obvious pain and weakness, each gesture economical and purposeful. When she finished eating, she made a contented sound, a soft hooting that seemed to express satisfaction, then looked at me with those intelligent eyes and vocalized something that sounded almost like a question, a rising intonation at the end. I had no idea how to respond, so I just nodded and said, "You're going to be okay. I'm going to help you. I promise I'll come back every day until you're healed." She seemed to understand the tone, if not the actual words. She shifted position slightly, wincing as she moved, and I saw how uncomfortable she must be, how painful it was to lie on the cold ground with nothing but leaves and moss beneath her, how the injury and malnutrition had made every movement an ordeal. I pulled out the blanket I'd brought and, moving slowly so as not to startle her, draped it over her torso. She looked at the blanket, then at me, and made another grateful sound, reaching down to pull the blanket closer, tucking it around herself with those huge hands. The gesture was so human, it was startling. We stayed like that until the light began to fade, sitting in companionable silence in that depression, and I felt a connection forming that I couldn't explain, something deeper than just helper and helped. something that felt almost like the beginning of a friendship, despite the vast differences between us. When the light started to fade, I stood up, my muscles stiff from sitting on the cold ground, and pointed at myself, then at the direction of the lodge, trying to communicate that I was leaving, but would return. She watched me go, and I swear I saw sadness in her expression, like she didn't want to be alone again, didn't want to return to the isolation and fear that had characterized however long she'd been lying injured in this depression. I looked back several times as I hiked away, and each time I could see her watching me until I finally disappeared from view into the darkening forest. I established a routine over the following days that became the center of my existence, the organizing principle around which everything else revolved. Every morning I'd wake up before dawn, prepare food and supplies, and hike out to the depression. She was always waiting, always seemed happy to see me in her own reserved way, making soft hooting sounds when I appeared through the hemlocks. I brought different foods, trying to figure out what she liked best, what provided the most nutrition, what her body needed for healing. She seemed to appreciate cooked meat most of all, especially deer and elk when I could get it, which made sense given her size and energy requirements, but also ate fruits enthusiastically, showing particular fondness for apples and berries. She would occasionally nibble on the leafy greens I brought, dandelion leaves, young fiddleheads, and wild lettuce, eating them with an expression that suggested she found them medicinal rather than enjoyable, consuming them because she knew they were good for her rather than because she liked the taste. I started staying longer each day, sometimes sitting there for hours, just being present with her, keeping her company during what must have been an agonizingly boring and uncomfortable recovery period. We developed a way of communicating that transcended language, a system of gestures and vocalizations that allowed for a basic exchange of meaning. She'd grunt in certain ways when she was in pain, make softer sounds when she was content. She developed a specific vocalization for being thirsty, a particular grunt combined with a gesture toward her mouth. When she needed to shift position or wanted help adjusting the blanket or splint, she'd look at me and make a requesting sound, almost pleading, and I'd help her move or adjust things to ease her discomfort. I learned to read her expressions, to understand when she needed water or was getting uncomfortable in one position, when she was having a particularly bad pain day, or when she was feeling relatively good. After about a week of daily visits, I noticed she was trying to put weight on the injured leg, testing it carefully, using her arms to push herself into a more upright position, and then gingerly touching the injured foot to the ground. The splint was holding well, doing exactly what it was supposed to do, and while she clearly still had significant pain, there was visible improvement. The swelling had decreased, and she moved with slightly more confidence. I checked the splint every day, carefully unwrapping the fabric bindings to examine the injury site, looking for signs of infection or other complications. The wound was healing cleanly as far as I could tell, with no redness or discharge or other warning signs. I made poultices from various herbs that my grandmother had taught me had anti-inflammatory properties, crushing plantain leaves and yarrow and applying them to the area around the break, wrapping everything back up carefully. She tolerated these ministrations with remarkable patience, seeming to understand I was trying to help, holding perfectly still even when the process must have been uncomfortable or painful. 2 weeks after the initial encounter, she was able to stand with support, using a thick branch as a crutch, leveraging herself upright for the first time since I'd found her. I watched in amazement as she rose to her full height, towering over me by at least 2 feet, maybe more, her head nearly level with branches I couldn't reach even when jumping. She was even more imposing standing up, the sheer mass and power of her body obvious in a way it hadn't been when she was lying down. But she looked down at me with those expressive eyes and made a soft hooting sound, and I understood she was showing me her progress, demonstrating that my help was working, proving that recovery was possible. I felt an absurd surge of pride and relief, like a parent watching their child take their first steps. By the third week, she was taking tentative steps, still relying heavily on the crutch, but genuinely mobile in a way she hadn't been since the injury. She'd walk around the depression, testing the leg, building strength in the muscles that had atrophied during her immobility, gradually increasing the amount of weight she put on the injured limb. By the fourth week, she could walk slowly without the crutch, though she still had a pronounced limp favoring the injured leg in a way that was obvious but no longer debilitating. She was healing, really healing, and I felt an overwhelming sense of accomplishment mixed with an approaching sense of loss. It was around this time that I realized she wasn't going to need my daily care much longer. She was mobile enough to forage on her own, strong enough to fend for herself, approaching the point where she could return to her normal life. The thought filled me with an unexpected sadness that caught me off guard. I'd come to look forward to our time together, to the strange friendship we'd developed, to having a purpose and a connection with another being, even if that being wasn't human. The isolation I'd craved when I first moved to the lodge now seemed less appealing, more like loneliness than solitude. But I knew she needed to return to her normal life. Whatever that looked like for a creature like her, needed to reclaim her independence and freedom rather than remaining dependent on human assistance. On what I thought might be one of our last days together, she did something that surprised me completely. She stood up with obvious purpose, gestured for me to follow her with a clear, beckoning motion, and began walking slowly out of the depression. I grabbed my pack and followed, curious about where she was leading me, excited at the prospect of seeing more of her world. She took me deeper into the forest, to places I'd never explored, areas that seemed deliberately remote and inaccessible, moving with more confidence now despite the limp. We walked for over an hour, moving through terrain that got progressively more rugged, and I realized she was showing me her territory, sharing her world with me, letting me into parts of the forest that probably no human had ever seen. She showed me a cave entrance hidden behind a waterfall that I never would have found on my own, a narrow opening in the rock face, concealed by the falling water and overhanging vegetation. She indicated a massive oak tree with deep claw marks on the trunk, gouges that extended 7 or 8 feet up, marks that I understood served as some kind of boundary marker or territorial sign. She led me to a grove where wild apples grew thick, the fruit small and tart but abundant, clearly an important food source. She showed me a clearing where the grass grew in a perfect circle, worn down by what had to be years of use, possibly a gathering place or communal area. It was like she was saying, "This is my home. I want you to know it. I want you to understand the world I inhabit." Each new location felt like a gift, like she was sharing sacred knowledge, trusting me with information that no human had likely ever possessed. When we returned to the depression, the sun was setting, painting everything in shades of orange and purple that made the forest look alien and magical. She looked at me for a long moment, her dark eyes holding mine, and I saw complex emotions playing across her face. Gratitude, affection, and something I couldn't quite identify. Then she reached out and touched my head gently, her huge hand covering my entire skull, but applying no pressure, just resting there in what felt like a blessing or an acknowledgement. Then she made a sound I hadn't heard before, a complex vocalization that seemed to carry layers of meaning I couldn't fully understand, something that encompassed gratitude and friendship and goodbye and promise all at once, a sound that made my chest tight with emotion. I understood then that she was going to leave, to return to her normal life, and that I needed to let her, needed to release her from this unusual arrangement. I nodded, feeling emotion tighten my throat in a way that embarrassed me, and said, "Take care of yourself. Be safe out here. Thank you for trusting me." She hooted once, a sound I'd learned meant acknowledgement or agreement, turned and walked into the darkening forest with that still visible limp. I watched until I couldn't see her anymore, until the shadows swallowed her completely, then gathered my things and hiked back to the lodge in the dark, using my flashlight to navigate the familiar trail, feeling an odd mixture of satisfaction and loss, pride in what I'd accomplished mixed with sadness at this ending. Except it wasn't an ending, I discovered over the following weeks. It was a transformation, a change in the nature of our relationship, but not a termination of it. I'd find gifts left on my porch in the morning, offerings that appeared overnight when I was sleeping. Large branches of firewood, neatly stacked in a way that no wind or natural process could explain. Dry wood that burned clean and hot, saving me hours of work. A pile of wild mushrooms, varieties I recognized as edible and valuable, hen of the woods and maytake, carefully arranged on a flat stone. Once I found a deer haunch, freshly killed and expertly butchered, the meat still warm, more protein than I could eat in a week. I knew these were from her, tokens of appreciation, her way of reciprocating the care I'd shown, maintaining our connection through an exchange of gifts. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of her in the forest during my foraging trips, though she never approached directly. I'd see movement in the periphery of my vision, spot her watching me from a distance of 100 yards or more, always making sure I was safe but respecting my space, maintaining the boundaries appropriate to our unusual relationship. Once I saw her following a ridgeline above me as I hiked through a valley, her form silhouetted against the sky, clearly tracking my progress, making sure I didn't run into trouble. The knowledge that she was out there, watching over me, made the forest feel less empty, less threatening, transforming potential loneliness into a comfortable solitude. The seasons changed with their inexorable rhythm. Summer arrived with its heat and humidity, bringing black flies and mosquitoes that made the woods temporarily unbearable, then faded into a spectacular autumn when the maples and oaks exploded in colors so vibrant they almost hurt to look at. I continued my foraging work, continued my solitary life in the lodge, but I was always aware of her presence in a way that was comforting rather than unsettling. She was out there, watching, protecting in her own way, a guardian I'd never asked for but had somehow acquired. Once, during a particularly violent thunderstorm, the kind of storm that makes the whole forest seem to shake, with wind howling through the trees and lightning striking close enough that I could smell the ozone, I heard something heavy moving on the porch. I looked out the window, nervous about what might be prowling around, to see her there, a massive silhouette against the lightning-lit sky, checking to make sure the lodge was secure, that the structure was sound, that I was safe inside. When she saw me at the window, she raised one hand in what might have been a wave or simply an acknowledgement, then disappeared into the storm, moving through weather that would have sent any sensible creature to shelter, braving the wind and rain to make sure I was protected. People occasionally ask me if I ever get lonely out here, so far from other people, so isolated from human society. I tell them I'm content, that I like the solitude, that I've learned to enjoy my own company. I don't mention the real reason I never feel truly alone, the presence that moves through these woods, the creature that considers me a friend, the being that watches over me with an attention that sometimes borders on devotion. How could I explain that to someone? They'd think I'd lost my mind, that isolation had made me delusional, that I was making up stories to cope with loneliness. But I know what I experienced. I know what continues to happen. Just last week, I was hiking in an area I don't usually explore, miles from the lodge on the eastern side of my grandmother's property, where the terrain gets rocky and difficult. I wasn't lost exactly, but I'd ventured further than intended, gotten caught up in following a particularly productive patch of medicinal roots, and wasn't entirely certain of the best route back. The sun was dropping toward the horizon, and I was starting to worry about navigating in the dark. That's when I saw her, standing on a ridge about 50 yards ahead, watching me. When she caught my eye, she started moving in a specific direction, clearly wanting me to follow. I did, trusting her completely, and she led me on a winding route through terrain I didn't recognize, taking paths that were clearly chosen to be easiest rather than most direct. After about 30 minutes, we emerged onto a logging road I knew well, one that would lead me directly back to the lodge. She'd guided me home. She hooted twice, our usual goodbye signal, and melted back into the trees before I could even properly thank her. I leave food out for her sometimes now, not out of obligation, but as gifts between friends. Fresh bread when I bake, smoked fish from the lake, honey from a local beekeeper I trade with. She always takes what I leave and always leaves something in return, maintaining the reciprocity that characterizes our relationship. Unusual stones with interesting colors or patterns, feathers from birds I've never seen in these woods. Once she left a carved piece of wood, shaped into a smooth oval that fit perfectly in my palm, its surface worn silky smooth, evidence of patience and skill. These exchanges are our language now, our way of maintaining the bond we formed. It's been almost 10 months now since I found her in that depression, broken and starving. 10 months since I made the choice to help rather than run. Looking back, I can't imagine having made any other decision. Yes, it was terrifying. Yes, it challenged everything I thought I knew. But it also became one of the most profound experiences of my life. The kind of experience that redefines your understanding of what's possible, what's real, what matters. I helped save her. And in return, she's become something I never anticipated. A guardian, a companion, a friend who exists outside the normal boundaries of human experience. I don't know how long this arrangement will continue. Maybe eventually she'll find others of her kind. Maybe one day I'll look for her and she'll simply be gone. But I don't think that day is coming soon. The signs of her continued engagement are everywhere if you know how to look. Tracks in the mud after a rain showing she's checked on the lodge, broken branches arranged in patterns I've come to recognize, the occasional sound in the night that I know is her voice announcing her presence. She's still here, still watching over me, still reciprocating the care I showed her in that desperate moment. She taught me something important. The world is stranger and more wonderful than our scientific frameworks admit. And I learned that kindness transcends species, that compassion doesn't require a shared language. The simple act of helping another creature in desperate need can create connections that defy rational explanation. Yesterday, I discovered a new patch of chanterelles near the creek. As I was carefully harvesting them, I heard a familiar sound from the trees behind me, that distinctive hooting call I've come to know better than any human voice. I turned to see her standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me work. She nodded toward my bag, then toward a section of the forest I hadn't explored yet. I understood immediately. She was indicating there were more chanterelles in that direction, sharing her knowledge, helping me succeed. We foraged together that afternoon, working in comfortable silence. Her eye for mushrooms is incredible, spotting them in places I would have walked right past. My bags were overflowing by the time the sun started to set. She helped me carry everything back to the lodge, and at the edge of the clearing, she set down her load, made our goodbye sound, and was gone. This is my life now, and I embrace it fully. A man in a hunting lodge in the Maine wilderness, and a Bigfoot in the surrounding forest, bound together by a broken leg and an act of compassion. It's not the life I planned, but it's the life I have, and I wouldn't change a single thing. She came to me starving and broken, and I helped her. Now she helps me, watches over me, shares her world. It's simple when you strip away all the complexity, two living beings recognizing vulnerability in each other and choosing to respond with care rather than fear. That's my story, the truth of my life in these remote Maine woods. Believe it or reject it, that's your choice. But it happened exactly as I've described it. And somewhere out there in those forests right now, as you hear these words, there's a creature with reddish-brown fur and a slight limp in her right leg, carrying memories of the human who saved her life, just as I carry memories of the creature who transformed mine. The evidence of her existence is all around me, woven into the fabric of my daily life. She's real, she's here, and she's my friend. That's the simple truth of it, and nothing will ever convince me otherwise. I know what I experienced, I know what continues to happen, and that knowledge, that certainty, that daily evidence of the impossible is the most valuable thing I possess.